From the very first moment Japanese pilots caught sight of the F6F Hellcat, thick-bodied, heavy-looking, slow on the ground, and nothing like the sleek, nimble A6M Zero they had been dominating the Pacific with, they laughed, confident that this new American fighter was nothing more than a clumsy metal brute, a machine that could never match the Zero's agility, turning radius, or lightning-fast climb. But the suspense deepens immediately, because as those pilots would soon discover, the Hellcat was not designed to play by the Zero's rules. It was engineered in secret, shaped by brutal lessons from early Pacific battles, armed with more power, more armor, more fire, and more forgiveness than anything the U.S. Navy had ever sent into the sky. And the narrator pulls viewers into the tension as the camera sweeps across a stormy Pacific horizon where Hellcats rise from carrier decks like steel predators taking flight, engines roaring with a deep, menacing growl that contrasts violently with the high-pitched hum of the Zero, and in that moment the audience begins to feel the shift, the slow, ominous realization that while Japanese aviators believed the sky belonged to them, America had quietly built a machine that would rewrite the rules of aerial combat, and the visuals tighten as pilots strap in, oxygen masks clipped, gloves tightened, hands steady on throttles, and carrier crews scramble across the decks under. Blinding sunlight and deafening winds while commanders whisper orders with tension sharp enough to cut steel. And the suspense escalates further as the narration explains that this was not merely the arrival of a new plane. It was the beginning of a total reversal of air dominance, a psychological turning point in the Pacific War, because once the Hellcat entered the fight, the kill ratios became almost unbelievable. Dozens of Zeros falling in a single day, entire enemy squadrons erased before they could even react, Japanese pilots returning to base in stunned silence, wings riddled with holes, realizing too late that the machine they had mocked was engineered not to dance with the Zero, but to destroy it with overwhelming power, speed, climb, dive, armor, and firepower. And by the time the scene cuts to the Hellcat's first full combat deployment, the audience is locked in suspense, fully aware that what comes next, across 6 massive, shocking points, is the story of how this ugly, underestimated American fighter became the Zero's worst nightmare, dominating the Pacific skies so completely that even surviving Japanese aces admitted they never stood a chance once the Hellcat arrived. As the Hellcats roared off the carrier decks and vanished into the blinding Pacific sun, the tone of the war in the air shifted with a force so subtle at first that Japanese pilots barely noticed it, until it was too late. Because behind every climb, every dive, every heavy-bodied turn of this new American fighter lay a quiet, deadly confidence engineered into its very frame, and the suspense tightens as the camera sweeps into the cockpit where the American pilot grips the control stick, feeling the raw, monstrous torque of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, pushing the machine forward with a violence no Zero pilot had ever felt from an opponent before, and in that moment, viewers sense the storm brewing in the sky as the narrator reveals that the Hellcat wasn't just built to match the Zero. It was built to erase the mistakes of Guadalcanal, to outclimb, outdive, outshoot, and outsurvive. The aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific through the early months of the war, and the tension escalates as 2 formations begin to converge. The slender, agile Zeros slicing through the blue like knives of wind, their pilots confident, relaxed, mocking even, believing they were about to swat another clumsy American experiment from the sky. But then the Hellcats begin their ascent, and the Zero pilots realize in a moment of chilling, gut-twisting fear that these American fighters are climbing far faster than any F4F Wildcat ever did. And the narrator heightens the suspense as the camera cuts to the Japanese commander whose eyes widen as he sees the impossible. This fat, heavy, Slow American plane closing distance in a steep, aggressive climb, the Zero simply cannot follow without losing energy, and when the first gun burst screams across the sky, 650 caliber machine guns erupting in a thunderous blaze. The Japanese pilot swerves in shock as tracer rounds tear through his formation, and the audience feels the electricity of the turning tide, because for the first time in the war, the Americans have a plane that doesn't break under pressure, doesn't burn from a single hit, doesn't stall when forced into steep dives, and doesn't fall apart in high G turns, and the suspense deepens as the narration explains that the Hellcat's heavy armor and bulletproof glass allow its pilot to dive straight into danger. Absorbing fire, the Zero's delicate aluminum frame could never survive, and as Japanese pilots whipped their controls violently, trying to outturn the Americans like they always had, they realized with rising horror that the Hellcats aren't playing their game. They're staying high, diving fast, climbing away, striking again and again with brutal, calculated precision, and while the Zeros dance and twirl with desperate talent, the Hellcats hit with overwhelming power, firing torrents of 50 caliber slugs that shear wings, ignite fuel tanks, rip through fuselages, and send decades of Japanese aerial dominance hurtling into the ocean. And by the time the combat cloud clears, stunned Japanese survivors limp back to base, wings shredded, bullet holes stitching their fuselages like metallic scars, their laughter gone, replaced with the realization that the American fighter they mocked, this thick-framed, iron-skinned Hellcat, has just rewritten the laws of aerial combat, setting the stage for the shocking revelations that will unfold through the remaining points, each one peeling back the layers of how the Hellcat became the Zero's worst nightmare in the Pacific skies. As the battered Zeros limped home and the Hellcats disappeared back into the endless blue horizon, the shockwaves of that first encounter echoed across every Japanese airbase in the Pacific, rippling through briefing rooms, mess halls, flight decks, and command bunkers as word spread that the Americans had unleashed a machine unlike anything the Imperial pilots had ever faced before, and the suspense rises as the narrator draws viewers into the tense atmosphere of those stunned Japanese squadrons, pilots sitting in silence, helmets still in their hands, staring at each other with expressions that hovered between confusion, disbelief, and a creeping fear they could not yet admit, because the battle they had just survived broke rules that had governed Pacific dogfighting since the first days of the war. Rules the Zero had dominated with flawless elegance, and now, suddenly, violently, those rules no longer applied, shattered by a brute of a fighter that was never meant to dance with them, but to swallow them whole, and the tension mounts as the camera follows a Japanese mechanic examining a Zero riddled with bullet holes, running his fingers along the torn metal where 50 caliber rounds ripped through the thin skin like paper, each puncture glowing like a warning that a new era of aerial combat had begun. And the audience is pulled deeper as the narrator reveals that even Japanese intelligence officers were stunned, poring over reports describing an American fighter with climb rates that defied logic, diving speeds that no Zero could match without disintegrating, armor plates thick enough to shrug off glancing hits, and firepower so overwhelming that a single burst could vaporize a target in midair. And the suspense tightens as the narrative cuts to the American carriers, where Hellcats land with casual confidence, their wings folding smoothly as deck crews swarm around them, pilots laughing, slapping each other on the back, their adrenaline still humming, because for the first time in the Pacific War, they feel the tide turning, not slowly, not gradually, but in a sudden, brutal surge, like a tidal wave crashing over the enemy, and the camera sweeps over the carrier deck where mechanics inspect the Hellcat's armor, noting how bullets flattened against their thick plates instead of punching through like they did to the Wildcats and Buffaloes that came before, while the narrator underscores that the Hellcat's creators at Grumman designed the plane with a single question in mind: what would it take to dominate the Zero? And the answer, now roaring across the sky, was a fighter that didn't need to outturn its opponent. It only needed to outclimb, outdive, and outshoot it. And the suspense deepens as the narrative moves to the Japanese command, where senior officers argue in hushed, tense voices about how to counter a machine that breaks every assumption they had relied on, because the Zero's unbeatable turning radius, once its crown jewel, now meant nothing when Hellcats refused to turn fight at all, and instead attacked. From above with murderous precision before climbing away untouched. And as viewers feel the weight of this shifting power, the narrator describes how pilots across the Pacific began to whisper that the sky no longer belonged to the Zero, that something monstrous had arrived, thick-skinned, merciless, and unstoppable. And by the time intelligence reports confirmed the name Hellcat, the Japanese airmen understood something chilling. This was not a temporary threat, not a small upgrade, not a limited deployment, but the beginning of a new storm, an American fighter built in vast numbers, flown from carriers that stretched across the Pacific, and engineered with one purpose: to hunt the Zero. Destroy the Zero and wipe its legacy from the clouds, leaving viewers breathless as Point One surges toward its next explosive phase, where the true nightmare of the Hellcat's capabilities will unfold in brutal, cinematic detail. As whispers of the Hellcat's terrifying performance spread across the Pacific, the psychological balance among Japan's once unyielding Zero pilots began to crack, because for the first time since the early triumphs of 1941 and 1942, they faced an enemy fighter that did not fear them, did not flee from them, did not crumble under their signature turning attacks. And the suspense swells as the narrator pulls viewers into the tense heart of a Japanese ready room where pilots gather around a hand-drawn chalkboard sketch of this new American monster. Thicker wings, heavier fuselage, wide-set landing gear, a beefy engine cowling that looked more like a battleship turret than part of a fighter plane. And the room falls eerily silent as they listen to the shaken survivors describe what happened in the sky. How the Hellcat dove like a meteor, how its energy retention was unnatural, how its guns screamed like thunder, how it ignored hits that would have torn a Zero apart, and how no matter what maneuver the Zero attempted, brake turns, loops, climbing spirals, snap rolls, the Hellcat simply refused to play, staying high and fast, striking only when it chose, and disappearing back into the sun with a power and confidence that left even the veterans rattled. And the suspense tightens as we cut to an American carrier briefing where pilots calmly study the Zero's weaknesses: its fragile frame, its poor high-speed handling, its inability to dive steeply without tearing its wings, its lack of armor, its empty fuel tanks that ignited with the smallest spark. And the tension builds as the narrator explains that these American pilots were no longer improvising. They were executing a systematic, meticulously developed playbook built from months of losses, intelligence reports, and brutal trial by fire, a playbook that turned the Hellcat into a precision instrument of destruction designed to dismantle the Zero's legacy piece by piece. And the camera sweeps across the deck as Hellcats prepare for launch, their massive engines coughing and booming like caged beasts eager for release, wings folding down with a heavy metallic clank. Carrier crews shouting over the roar of propellers, the ocean heaving beneath them like it knows what's coming. And then, with a violent lurch, the first Hellcat is hurled from the deck into the open sky, accelerating with a fury that turns the narrator's voice into a rising wave of tension. Because every launch marks another step toward the inevitable truth. The Zero's reign is ending, and fast, and as the camera shifts to a Japanese air patrol scanning the horizon, the once cocky pilots now sit rigid in their seats, gloved hands tightening on controls, eyes darting nervously toward the sun, the clouds, the ocean below, knowing the Hellcat could appear at any moment from any direction with savage, unstoppable violence, and the suspense peaks when a faint black speck emerges overhead, growing larger, darker, deadlier by the second, until the Japanese leader shouts a warning and his squadron banks hard. But it's too late, because the Hellcats come screaming down like thunderbolts, their 650 caliber guns unleashing blinding streams of destruction, slicing through Zeros before the dogfight even begins, engines howling as they pull up and disappear into the vertical sky, leaving behind nothing but flames, smoke trails, and shocked pilots who never imagined an American machine could move with such terrifying authority. And by the time the survivors stagger back to their bases, landing their damaged Zeros on strips of dirt and metal pierced with holes. The fear they once mocked has become a chilling reality. The Hellcat isn't just competitive, it's dominant. Relentless and engineered for one purpose only, to erase every last Zero from the Pacific skies. A revelation that sends Point One racing toward its next electrifying surge of suspense and destruction. As the Zero survivors taxied to a stop, stepping out of their aircraft with trembling hands and hollow eyes, the atmosphere on every Japanese airfield shifted from pride to a heavy, suffocating dread, because the pilots who once joked that American planes were slow, heavy, and laughable were now whispering in hushed, shaken voices about a monster that dropped from the sky with terrifying precision. And the suspense thickens as the narrator draws viewers into the tense briefing rooms where Japanese officers demand explanations. How could a plane that looked so bulky climb so fast? How could something that heavy dive with such murderous speed? How could its pilot remain calm while their own nimble? Battle-proven Zeros spiraled desperately, losing energy, altitude, and control. But the answers never come, only more confusion, more reports, more fragments of encounters in which the Hellcat dictated every second of the fight, attacking only when the Americans had the advantage and retreating only when they chose. And the camera cuts to an exhausted Japanese ace, an elite fighter who once racked up victories with effortless grace, sitting alone on a folding chair, his flight suit soaked with sweat, staring down at his shaking hands as he murmurs that the Hellcat did not fight like a plane. It fought like a predator, a machine that stalked, waited, and punished mistakes with merciless bursts of .50 caliber fury. And the tension grows as the narration shifts to American carriers where Hellcats now dominate the decks, their pilots walking with a confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from a cold, calculated understanding. We finally have the right machine, and the camera follows them into a briefing where an officer circles the weaknesses of the Zero, its fragile wing spars, lack of armor, fuel tanks that ignite instantly, and inability to pull out of steep dives, and the Hellcat pilots take notes calmly, knowing they don't need to outrun the Zero in a turn. They only need to control altitude, energy, and momentum. And the suspense mounts as the next battle unfolds over a vast stretch of Pacific water. The Hellcats cruising above the clouds like silent giants while the Zeros patrol below, unaware that their world is seconds from collapse. And when the American flight leader spots them, he signals with a simple hand gesture, boom and zoom, and then they dive as one, engines screaming, guns flashing in a thunderous eruption that shreds the first Japanese formation before they even understand what is happening, forcing the survivors into desperate maneuvers they mastered years ago but which now betray them. Because every tight turn bleeds precious energy, every quick roll slows the aircraft. Every evasive attempt makes them even easier prey for the Hellcat's superior speed and crushing firepower. And the camera follows one Zero pilot in particular, a once-celebrated ace who tries every trick in his book, hammerhead stalls, spirals, sweeping left rolls, sudden drops. But the Hellcat remains glued behind him like a steel shadow, closing distance with terrifying inevitability, its 6 guns blinking with fiery pulses as rounds tear into the Zero's fuel tank, igniting it in a brilliant, horrifying bloom of flame that lights the sky. And the suspense tightens as the narration reveals the bitter truth settling into Japanese command. The long-revered dogfighting style that had carried them to dominance no longer held any power against this new American machine, because the Hellcat wasn't built to duel. It was built to control. Dominate and destroy its armor, letting it soak damage, its engine letting it climb out of danger at will, its guns ripping through Zeros like paper. And as Japanese officers stare at casualty reports piling higher each day, a realization slowly spreads through their ranks. The era of the Zero is ending, crushed beneath the roar of a fighter they once laughed at. And as Point One drives toward its next explosive surge, the viewers feel the rising dread, the unstoppable shift, the suffocating suspense that signals something massive. The Hellcat is only just beginning its reign of destruction. As the casualty reports multiplied and the once invincible reputation of the Zero began to crumble, the psychological shock rippled far beyond the flight lines and briefing rooms. spreading all the way up the chain of command to Japanese naval headquarters, where senior officers, men who once boasted that Japan ruled the sky unquestionably, now pored over maps with tight jaws and trembling hands, searching for explanations that didn't exist. And the suspense thickens as the camera glides past stacks of intelligence papers stamped urgent, filled with frantic observations. Hellcat climbs unusually well. Enemy armor resisting standard hits. A6M unable to sustain energy advantage. Recommend avoiding engagement beyond initial contact, each report dripping with dread, each note signaling another fracture in the Zero's legend. And tensions skyrocket when the narrator brings viewers into the dimly lit war room where a senior Japanese admiral slams his fist onto the table, demanding to know how an aircraft that looks like a flying anvil could butcher their elite squadrons with humiliating ease, but no officer can answer. Because the truth they fear admitting is unavoidable. The Americans have finally built a machine that doesn't merely challenge the Zero, it erases it. And the camera cuts to footage of American carriers slicing across a calm Pacific, their decks lined with Hellcats in perfectly staggered rows, each one glistening under the sun like a sharpened blade, each one representing a fighter that doesn't break under pressure, doesn't catch fire on the first hit, doesn't fall apart when pushed past its limits. And the suspense grows as the narrator describes the Hellcat's creation, how its designers at Grumman engineered it with brutally simple priorities: power, durability, range, climb, firing arcs, kill zones, and survivability, building a fighter whose very existence was a rebuttal to the Japanese assumption that agility alone ruled the skies. And as the film cuts to a squadron of Hellcats launching into the golden light of dawn, engines thundering like rolling thunder across the endless ocean, the audience feels the moment when the Pacific shifts forever. Because these aren't inexperienced rookies anymore. These are pilots trained in new tactics, armed with new intelligence, flying a machine built to dominate from above. And the narrator draws viewers tighter into the tension as the scene shifts to a group of Japanese scouts patrolling high above a chain of islands, scanning the horizon with a silence born from fear, their nerves stretched thin as violin strings, their eyes flicking anxiously upward where they know the Hellcats lurk, waiting, hunting. And then it happens. The ominous glint of sunlight reflecting off distant wings, a shape materializing from the sky like a phantom, growing larger by the second. And before the scouts can even relay a warning, the Hellcats strike. Descending in coordinated fury, 50 caliber guns blazing with a deafening roar that tears through the formation, sending Zeros spiraling downward in flames while the survivors scramble helplessly, their desperate, evasive twists bleeding precious altitude as the Hellcats loop effortlessly back into position, climbing with monstrous energy to prepare for yet another punishing dive. And the suspense becomes suffocating as the narrator reveals the brutal truth that Japanese pilots now whispered only in private. The Hellcat chooses when the fight begins and when it ends, because if a Zero tries to outrun it, the Hellcat catches it. If a Zero tries to climb, the Hellcat overtakes. If a Zero dives, the Hellcat follows with terrifying speed. And if a Zero tries to turn, the Hellcat simply climbs away to strike again from above, again and again, crushing morale, crushing confidence, crushing the very identities of pilots once defined by supremacy in the air. And by the time the smoke clears and another squadron of Zeros is wiped from the sky, Japanese commanders stare at the impossible new reality. The fighter they mocked, the plane they called slow, heavy, and laughable, has become the executioner of their air arm, the grim reaper of the Pacific skies. And Point One marches closer to its devastating peak, setting the stage for the next wave of shocking revelations about how the Hellcat turned Japan's pride into wreckage scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. As the Pacific skies darkened with the smoke of endless battles, and the Hellcats' kill counts soared into numbers so lopsided they seemed impossible, the final truth settled over Japanese Air Command like a suffocating fog. The war in the air was lost. Not slowly, not gradually, but in a sudden, brutal collapse the moment America unleashed a fighter the Japanese had mocked with laughter and arrogance. A fighter they believed too heavy, too slow, too clumsy to ever threaten the Zero's supremacy. And the suspense explodes as the narrator lifts viewers into the final. Devastating battles where entire Japanese squadrons rose into the sky only to be erased in minutes. Their formations shattered, their radios choked with panic, their evasive maneuvers useless against the Hellcat's overwhelming speed. Power and brutal firepower, and as the camera sweeps across a burning sky filled with falling aircraft, flaming debris and spiraling smoke trails, the audience realizes the horrifying scale of the reversal. Japan's once unstoppable Zero pilots, the legends of 1941, now struggled just to survive a single sortie, and even the most experienced aces, men who had dominated the Pacific for years, found themselves hunted by Hellcats that attacked from above, struck with mechanical perfection, and vanished back into the sun before a Zero could even respond. And the tension tightens further as we enter the Japanese command bunker, where senior officers stare at casualty maps covered in red, their hands shaking as they accept the crushing truth. The F6F Hellcat hasn't merely beaten the Zero, it has annihilated it, wiping out over 5,000 enemy aircraft, achieving kill ratios as grotesquely unbalanced as 19-1, numbers so shocking they rewrote the very math of aerial warfare. And the suspense reaches its breaking point as the narrator brings viewers into the cockpit of a lone Zero pilot on one of the final days of the war. His fuel low, his squadron destroyed, his hands trembling over the controls as he scans the horizon for the predator he knows is coming. And then, there, a speck in the sun, growing larger, sharper, deadlier, a Hellcat dropping into a shallow dive with the patience of a seasoned hunter. 650 caliber guns armed and ready, the end approaching in a wave of thunder and steel. And as the Japanese pilot whispers a final prayer, the audience feels the tragic collapse of a legacy that once ruled the Pacific skies but could not withstand the unstoppable rise of the American war machine. And the camera pulls back to reveal carriers stretching across the ocean like floating cities, their decks swarming with Hellcats ready for launch, engines roaring with the confidence of a force that changed the very fate of the war. And the narrator's voice closes with chilling finality. The fighter they laughed at became the machine that ended them, the sky's new ruler, the hunter that swept the Zero from the Pacific and carved its name into history as the aircraft that turned mockery into terror, dominance into collapse, and Japan's pride into wreckage scattered across thousands of miles of open ocean, leaving viewers breathless, stunned, and unable to look away as the screen fades to black.